That's me, Groucho Marx.
Our guest today is a writer and producer who's worked on countless television programs and documentaries. But for these purposes, we're going to focus on Steve Stoliar's newly refurbished memoir, Raised Eyebrows, My Years in Groucho's House, about his professional and personal relationship with comedy icon Groucho Marx. And Steve, I think this all begins with your desire as a young man to see a film that had become something of a rarity at that time in the late 60s, early 70s, Animal Crackers.
That is correct. For many years, Animal Crackers was the missing link in the Marx Brothers canon of 13 films. Now we take them all for granted, and they're yours for the click of a mouse. But
sure.
In the 60s and 70s, the other Marx films were around and had been on television, and people were familiar with them. But Animal Crackers, because of a legal entanglement where the rights weren't renewed, and so they reverted back to the authors and composers of the original play. And Universal, which had bought up the old Paramount films, didn't think it was worth spending a nickel to clear the rights to a Marx Brothers film that had been unseen for a generation. They thought, no one's going to care about that. And none of my friends thought it made any sense because they were all Marx Brothers fans. So I started a committee at UCLA where I was going to school, which makes sense rather than driving to UCLA from whatever school I was attending, and started a petition drive to put pressure on Universal to re-release the film. And I got in touch with Erin Fleming, who was the controversial woman in charge of Groucho's life back then, and she arranged for Groucho to come to UCLA. And at the time, I was truly a Marx Brothers fanatic, reading everything I could and committing the lines from their films to memory. And I had thought that if I could just shake Groucho's hand and thank him for all the laughs, I could die a happy kid.
Right.
But instead, we got the film released, and I was rewarded with the plum position of being Groucho's secretary and archivist and working inside his house for the last 3 years of his life.
Now, how does that conversation go? Erin Fleming says to you, Steve, you did such a great job getting Animal Crackers out of mothballs. Let's see what you can do at the house?
Essentially, yeah. I had a couple of summer jobs fall through in '74, for which I remain eternally grateful. Because if they hadn't fallen through, it might not have happened. But my back was against the wall, and my dad was pestering me, wanting me to go down to Burger King and Taco Bell and see if they needed someone to flip burgers or whatever.
Right.
And so I thought, all right, I have nothing to lose, and I still had their phone number from the Animal Crackers campaign a few months earlier. And I called, and Erin answered the phone, and I said, is there anything that you can think of that might need doing that? And she said, well, actually, I had been Groucho's secretary, but now I'm his manager, and I haven't been able to deal with all of the fan letters that have been coming in. We need someone also to be Groucho's archivist, to arrange all of his memorabilia, which is going to be donated to the Smithsonian after he dies. And in my mind's eye, it's like a Tex Avery cartoon where she's still talking on the phone while I'm knocking on the front door in Beverly Hills. I couldn't believe I had lucked into that. I mean, part of it was that I had proven myself to a degree with the Crackers campaign, but if I hadn't called, she probably would have hired someone else.
We're talking with Steve Stoliar. His book is Raised Eyebrows, My Years in Groucho's House. And, Steve, you found yourself a kid fresh out of his teenage years in the midst of old Hollywood, both literally and figuratively, because a lot of these great iconic movie stars from the classic golden era of Hollywood were still around and were visiting Groucho while you were there.
Well, it's interesting. Groucho was never really that impressed with famous actors and actresses. And as a matter of fact, when he was at MGM in the mid-30s and early 40s, he didn't sit with Clark Gable and Greta Garbo and Robert Taylor and Joan Crawford. He sat with the writers, who were considered second-class citizens,
right?
Because they were interesting and stimulating, and they talked about politics, and they were funny and all this. And he tended to think of actors as just kind of self-involved and vacuous. Some of them weren't, of course. So he preferred the company of writers, and so I got to meet quite a few of the writers that had impacted his films and his life. I mean, Maury Riskind, who worked on Coconuts and Animal Crackers and Night at the Opera, Nat Perrin, who worked on Monkey Business and Duck Soup, and S.J. Perelman, who, in addition to working for the Marx Brothers, was one of the premier humorists of the 20th century, and his pieces for the New Yorker filled about 20 books. He could be a little cantankerous because he had accomplished so much on his own. I mean, he won an Oscar for writing Around the World in 80 Days, and people, oh, what was Groucho like? Wow, you wrote for the Marx Brothers, and they just kind of dismissed him as a gag man. But they got along fine the night that I was there. After dinner, he took out a cigarette and said, "Do you mind if I smoke?" And Groucho said, "I don't care if you burn." And Perelman said, "That was good, Groucho. Now let's try it for timing." I thought, hey, this is kind of cool. So there were the behind-the-scenes people and some of the directors. But then also there was George Burns and Mae West and Jack Lemmon and Steve Allen, a lot of megawatt talents.
Well, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a Bob Hope enthusiast, so I have to ask about Bob. Were Bob and Groucho friends?
Yes. As a matter of fact, Hope came to Groucho's house for Groucho's 85th birthday party, and people were taking different turns, either singing or doing a few minutes of entertaining, and Hope was actually on his way to a testimonial dinner for Danny Thomas, so he was in a tuxedo, but he stopped by, and Groucho said, "This is a man who has made me laugh." And Hope said, "Oh, Groucho, you don't have to say that." And Groucho said, "If you weren't here, I wouldn't say it." And Hope just kind of threw up his hands and said, it's been going on like that for 40 years. But because I was on the inside, they didn't know if I was his grandson or what, so there was no kind of attitude like, I don't know who this kid that's talking to me. They just accepted me as I must be there for a reason. So I got to meet a lot of my heroes under very comfortable circumstances, and also the other two extant Marx Brothers, Zeppo and Gummo, who were the straight men in the films and in vaudeville.
Right.
And I have the distinction of being able to say that Zeppo and I dated the same woman.
No, wait a minute. How did...
She was 19, I was 20, and he was 74. So it was a December of the following year thing. What happened was I was dating this student, Linda, and we were supposed to go out one night, and it was a night when Zeppo was coming up from Palm Springs to have dinner at Groucho's. And I said to Erin, that's a shame. I'd like to meet him. And she said, well, why don't you stay for dinner? And I said, I'd like to, but I have a date tonight. And she said, bring her. And I thought, ooh, I like that. Because Linda was mature beyond her years. She was very unflappable. And I thought, this just might flap her. So I picked her up, and she said, where are we going? And I said, it's a little out-of-the-way place. And then when I turned from Sunset Boulevard onto Hillcrest, she said, I know where we're going. I don't want to do this. And I said, too bad. But what was really cool was she was very attractive, blonde hair, blue eyes, and intelligent. And Zeppo kind of took a liking to her, which was funny. He was saying, you and Linda ought to visit me in Palm Springs sometime. And I said, I was there when I was a kid, and it was just sweltering. And he said, well, when were you there, in the summer? I said, yeah. And he said, well, Steve, it's cold in Alaska during the winter, too. So she and I broke up, and I had a couple of photos that I wanted Zeppo to sign. So in my cover letter, when I mailed the photos off to Palm Springs, I said, by the way, Linda and I broke up. I know you've been around the block a few times. Do you have any advice for the lovelorn? And a couple of days later, my phone rings. Steve, it's Zeppo Marx. How are you? Listen, I got your letter and the photos. God, I was good looking back then. But listen, I don't want to step on your toes, but do you think Linda would go out with me? And I thought, this is really weird. I write him for advice for the lovelorn, and he's hitting on her.
Sure.
He said, I would never want to do anything that you wouldn't approve of. You understand, if this is at all a problem. I said, no. She enjoyed meeting you, and so I got in touch with her, and she thought it was kind of funny and intriguing. So they went out once. He took her to dinner in San Diego and a jai game in Tijuana. And the next time I saw him, he said, Steve, Linda was very nice. I want you to know I never even kissed her goodnight. She's very sweet, but all she did was talk about herself. And then I ran into her on campus, and she said, Zeppo was very nice, but all he did was talk about himself. And I thought, this is really strange, but for the rest of my life, I will be able to say that Zeppo. And then whenever Zeppo would be at a party at Groucho's and he'd be talking to someone, he'd say, oh, there's Steve. He and I went out with the same girl, but he got further with her than I did.
Are you making love to me?
Why not? Everyone.
That was Zeppo Marx singing and Harpo Marx whistling from 1932's Horse Feathers. We'll continue with our conversation with Steve Stoliar right after this charming retromercial. Take it away, George.
Tomorrow, first thing.
And we're back talking with author and researcher, writer, producer Steve Stoliar about his book, Raised Eyebrows, My Years in Groucho's House. We were talking about Zeppo Marx before, and the funny thing is, he's sort of the forgotten Marx brother in a way, but all of the movies where Zeppo is part of the team, those tend to be the best films.
He was in the good ones, the Paramount films. Yeah. They weren't necessarily good because he was in them, but once he is subtracted from the group and you have to put up with all of this kind of sappy, oh gosh, right. We've got to make good or else we're... and you start pining for that rapport that was there because he was blood kin to the other brothers. So even though he didn't have a whole lot to do, he did add to it, and there was that. They all looked similar. They had similar traits, their faces and voices, and so once he left, there was something missing. But he was never quite happy being an actor. I mean, by the time he joined the act, the other three had really solidified their characters, and Gummo, who had been the straight man, went off to World War I, and they drafted, so to speak, Zeppo into the act when he was in his teens, and he didn't have a lot of fun stuff to do then. So it wasn't that he couldn't be funny, or, if they had come up with some interesting, wild character, he couldn't have played it. It's just that the slot he filled wasn't particularly compelling, and that carried over into the films. I mean, even in Monkey Business, he's the romantic lead that right. Beats up the bad guys and gets the girl, but it's sort of incidental to the craziness of the Marx Brothers. So he was looking to get out, and he did after Duck Soup, and ended up being an extremely successful agent and handled Gable and Lombard and Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray and Lana Turner and Lucille Ball. So he did okay. He was much more successful at that, and there was no competition because the boys weren't doing that, and he wasn't acting, so that worked out better.
He is responsible for one of my favorite moments in Duck Soup, where he just walks into the room wearing half a hat. And he looks at it and then just sort of throws it away and just carries on with the scene.
And it was a good take.
Yeah. Did Groucho, when you were with him, did he ever speak about working without the rest of his brothers, like in his films like Copacabana or Double Dynamite?
He was very dismissive of those films. You know, it's interesting because I keep in touch with a number of Marx fans, or they figure out how to get in touch with me and have questions, and that's fine. And what I find is that people are so forgiving now. I'll hear from people who love Go West and the Big Store, and they'll say, oh, and I saw Double Dynamite and Girl in Every Port, and he was so funny, and that was so... But if you ask Groucho about those, he'd say, those were lousy pictures. I did it because I had a contract. And so we didn't tend to talk about those. You know, people said, what did he say about Skidoo? Did you ask him about Skidoo?
Right,
Skidoo was this really weird last film he did in '68 that was directed by Otto Preminger, that had Carol Channing and Jackie Gleason and George Raft and all these weird people in it, with a song, theme song by Nilsson. Right. I mean, it was just this, it's awful, but people think it's sacrilege to say that any of their movies were lousy, but if Groucho were around, he'd be the first to say they stink. One day he came to the lunch table, and he looked kind of down, and he said, whatever made Bazell think he could direct? Now, Eddie Bazell directed At the Circus and Go West, which are two of their weakest films. And I don't know whether he had just been seeing one on TV or what, but it was as if he had just come from the set, and he was really disillusioned about where his career was. Whatever made Bazell think he could direct? So a lot of things that people ask me about are things that didn't come up because I didn't quite see the point of wasting Groucho's time getting him to talk about, you know, wow, you worked with Andy Russell in Copacabana. What was he really like? Let's blow the lid off Andy Russell beneath the glitter. What was he? So, of course, you know, we talked about Margaret Dumont and Leo McCarey and other people in Hollywood that he was interacting with. And, you know, he was very proud of the quiz show because it was so successful and because a lot of intellectuals watched it. He was always kind of startled and delighted when someone from the literary world would say, you know, whatever I'm doing Thursday night, I drop it because your show is on.
Right.
And it was also the best money he ever made. I mean, he said at one point, you know, because he was kind of outspoken politically as a lifelong Democrat and a liberal, and someone asked if he was interested in running for governor, and he asked how much it pays, and they told him, and he said, I make that much every 3 weeks doing a quiz show. Right. So it's just, why would he want to put himself through that? But he would, you know, I was helping out with a book that he and Hector Arce were putting together called The Secret Word is Groucho, which was the behind-the-scenes story of You Bet Your Life, and interviews with the staff of the show and certain contestants. And one of my delightful chores for a while was screening 16-millimeter prints of the show with Groucho's grandson, Andy Marx, and we were writing down particularly funny exchanges for use in an appendix in the back of the book. And Groucho would shuffle in and sit down, and he'd kind of chuckle at some of the stuff. And then every now and again, there'd be a question that would stump the contestant, and he would say to the screen, that was an easy one. You should have known that. Come on. It was Colorado. Of course it's Colorado.
A couple of people with unusual occupations.
That was a clip from the radio version of You Bet Your Life, right here on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. Our guest is writer and producer and documentarian, archivist, personal secretary to Groucho Marx, everything. Steve Stoliar. His book is Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House. Earlier, we had mentioned Erin Fleming, the controversial actress who became Groucho's companion in the last years of his life and then eventually his manager, effectively taking over his life. And she met with a tragic end. She wound up committing suicide later on, but there was some mental illness there, wasn't there?
Yes. She was a paranoid schizophrenic. She took a lot of prescription medication, and she also smoked pot and did coke. So, I mean, it's a volatile combination of things. So she was very, very difficult to get along with, because something that you thought would be totally innocuous would send her into a screaming rage and throwing things and yelling, and she had a loud voice. And then other things we'd hear about and we'd think, oh man, how are we going to keep this from her, because she's going to blow her top. And then she'd find out about it and she'd go, oh no, that's just the way he is. And we'd think, how does she... So she was very, very difficult. She alienated lots of people. She was his business manager, but then would screw up a lot of deals because her ego would get in the way, and there'd be something outrageous that she would demand, saying, well, Groucho insists that blah, 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 when Groucho hadn't insisted at all. So she was... It's a tough thing because, one of the points I make in my book, Raised Eyebrows, is Andre Gide's quote, "The color of truth is gray." It's very easy to make someone a hero and someone else a villain, but people in life are rarely all one or the other.
Right.
And Aaron, there were positive elements to Aaron's presence in Groucho's life. For one thing, he enjoyed having her around. She stoked his ego. She did help take advantage of that renaissance of the Marx Brothers. But on the other hand, she was pushing him to do things that if he had been, he had a fairly severe stroke in 1972 that impaired him to a large degree, although he had so much going for him to begin with,
right,
that an impaired Groucho was still more entertaining and funnier than a lot of people who are fine.
Right.
And I think she never really accepted his mortality, and she just kept thinking that if she yelled and shook him and kept a positive attitude, the rust would fall off his brain and he'd be like he was when he was younger. So she did push him, but he enjoyed the adulation of a new generation of fans. Hearing a whole auditorium full of people standing up and applauding is, feels great. So, and also his children weren't particularly interested in taking on an increasingly infirm elderly parent. I mean, a lot of people can relate to that. His son Arthur had an up-and-down relationship with Groucho long before Aaron came along. He wrote a book, A Life with Groucho, in the 50s that, if you read it, seems pretty harmless, but for some reason Groucho threatened to sue him over it. Nothing came of it, but the idea that he would sue his son. And then when Arthur divorced his first wife and remarried, Groucho never liked his second wife, and in fact stayed friends with his first wife, who was the mother of his grandchildren. And I think there was a certain competition because Arthur was a writer and Groucho wanted to be a writer, and so that was always a rough one. But Aaron drove a big wedge between Groucho and Arthur. Groucho's older daughter Miriam had a big problem with alcohol and was in and out of facilities. She, from what I hear, she was the one of the three children that inherited his brilliance. But unfortunately, she had other demons that stood in her way. And then his youngest daughter, Melinda, really remained the apple of his eye for the most part, but she after a while, wanted nothing to do with Hollywood and moved up to Northern California and turned her back on the whole entertainment thing. She would come to visit, but no one was going to be in a position of wanting to be responsible for him. And in fact, Aaron told us, if Arthur had his way, he'd put Groucho in a home. And Groucho was terrified of being stuck in some facility. We'll never know if that was true or not,
right,
because we were never sure if what Aaron told us was absolutely true or fudged somewhat or complete fabrication. But anyway, it was a complex dynamic between Aaron and Groucho, and as he grew weaker, he grew more dependent on her, but he was growing more dependent on an unbalanced woman, so it was, kind of nitroglycerin-y.
Dear old dad,
Before we go, this has nothing to do with Groucho Marx whatsoever, but you might be, I think, the only person that I'm aware of who does a Bennett Cerf impression.
Well, children stop me on the street.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard for me to run errands because they'll stop. They won't let me go, and they'll say, please do your Bennett Cerf impression. Right. And I have no choice but to say, are you currently appearing on Broadway, and would I know you primarily for unsavory acts performed with citrus fruits or young children? I think that's a no. Oh, all right, then it isn't who I thought it was.
Well, when I watch that show, what I always notice is that when it's a beautiful woman who is the mystery guest, a beautiful actress and Mamie Van Doren, Jane Mansfield, he gets it within 5 minutes. I don't know if he's recognizing their fragrance. I mean, I don't know how deeply he was fascinated by these buxom blondes.
Some people have opined that he often knew who it was, but kind of pretended not to give others a chance, and whether he knew because he wasn't supposed to, or whether he just because he had his thumb on the pulse of where any celebrity was, who was coming to town to promote this and all that. I don't know, but it's interesting that you divided it sexually. I'll have to watch for that and see if that's truer than when a male is on.
So I guess really the best way to get this book, would it be via a bookstore? Would it be Amazon.com? Or
Amazon, the book is available in 3 floor mats.
Oh, okay. Good.
There's the Kindle version, which means you set fire to it, I guess.
Right, yeah.
There's the audio book, which I got a kick out of recording because I was able to slip into and out of all the voices as I told the story, similar to how I just did on your show.
Right.
And if people would like, my cat just jumped up on my shoulders, and I'm in pain because he has sunk his claws into the back of my neck. But I'm professional enough to finish what I was saying. If people would like to order a copy of the actual book for the 7 people that still read actual paper books, they can. I'd be happy to sign or inscribe it to them via my website, which is stevestoliar.com, STOLIAR. But and they're all available on Amazon if that's asking too much of them.
Maybe the cat was trying to have you push the Kindle version. It is the 21st century. Maybe that's
the Kindle version.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Steve, I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show. And, Steve, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. You too.
This meeting brings back memories. Childhood days, lemonade, romance. My life was wrapped around a circus. Her name was Lydia. I met her at the World's Fair in 1900, marked down from 1940. Lydia.